Energy transition is certainly a hot topic right now. The shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources in an effort to reduce CO2 emissions may be the definition of what everyone is thinking. But in the expanding space, is there a new definition? And why does this matter? We're going to break it all down for you right here on UBS Trending. Hi, everybody, and welcome to UBS Trending. I'm Anthony Pastore. Please join me in welcoming Paolo Frattaroli and Dan Smith from Neuberger Berman, our partners, just from across the street, as a matter of fact. Literal street, not Wall Street, but the literal street. Right. Good to have you guys here in the studio with us. So, we've been talking for such a long time about the energy transition, and I think that's kind of this phrase that's getting thrown around quite a lot, and maybe people think they know what it means, or maybe they do, maybe they don't. Paolo, what does energy transition mean to you?
It's really a multi-decade process. And so, there's this notion that it's tied to renewables, as you've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, but it's tied to everything energy. There's been certain events in the past that have accelerated energy transition. One that comes to mind is the shale revolution. Mm-hmm. And so the shale revolution literally unlocked vast energy reserves in the United States in terms of oil and gas. And so that abundance drove not just a lot of gas in particular, but inexpensive gas. And so long story short, gas has replaced coal over the last 10 to 15 years, and there's been significant decarbonization associated with that. Pre-shale revolution, coal was 50% of the electricity feedstock. Today, coal is sub 20%. Natural gas was below 20%. Today, natural gas is above 40%. And so from a sheer power demand perspective, which I hope we'll talk about later, it's been this massive transformation. The other part about shale that is a huge thematic with energy transition, but more from a global perspective, is the U.S. has become a leading exporter of both oil and gas. And so as we see happening in the United States in terms of this transition from coal to gas and the related decarbonization, we're starting to see that globally, and we'll participate on that. Last, I'll be quick here, but energy transition is often misunderstood. The way we look at it is also in the sense of energy addition. Today, we're not using any less hydrocarbons than we were a few years ago. In fact, we use more oil globally today than we did in 2019 pre-pandemic. We use more natural gas today than we did pre-pandemic. And so this idea of energy addition really makes sense to us because we're not using any less hydrocarbons, but we're adding wind, we're adding solar, we're adding renewable sources.
I love the way you say that, actually, because I think there is sometimes a misconception. I mean, there are maybe some people out there that think you can turn off a switch from fossil fuels to turn on all renewables and wind and solar and all that, and it's just not possible. You need those fossil fuels to start fueling these other renewable. While you said you can see these other ones increasing, and maybe we will see a decrease, but I feel like we might be decades away from that, and you both are the experts here. But Dan, just kind of piggybacking on that, as you sit here and hear the energy addition versus energy transition, what are your thoughts on that as well?
Well, I think the big thing, Anthony, that the world hasn't gotten credit for is that CO2 reduction, right? If you look at the US EIA data, you'll see that since 2007, really our power production has reduced CO2 emissions dramatically. If we take a step even further back, we go back 30 years, the US has had a net reduction in CO2 emissions. Given the size of our economy, given the success of our economy over those 30 years, that's a huge achievement, and really just no one wants to talk about it. And so that's why we're trying to get that message out and really talk about the fact that that natural gas demand, that consumption growth, is really driving that. And at the end of the day, we think that trend's going to continue because that demand continues to grow because natural gas is cheaper, it's more abundant. And if you think about natural gas power plants, they run a lot more efficiently than coal plants, and they just have increased flexibility again. And that flexibility is really important to the point that you just made.
Yeah, but does that, I guess, as investors here, does it give you concern that as renewables take shape and become even more used and by consumers, what about the traditional kind of energy assets like the fossil fuels? Does it make you think, well, those are going to start to lose their value?
No, and it's the right question to ask, Anthony. Look, we don't ignore renewables. We invest in utility scale renewable energy. We invest in utilities. Our approach is more free cash flow generating renewables that are tied to long-term contracts, so visibility of cash flow versus the other way you can invest in renewables is on the technology side. The correlation between both is actually very low, so it makes sense. But to answer your question, one of the largest misunderstood or rather underappreciated demand drivers for traditional fossil fuels is the petrochemical space. Petrochemicals are the building blocks to synthetic fibers, to different types of rubbers, to plastics that are ultimately responsible for everyday items. Think renewable items, solar component parts, wind turbine parts, battery parts. To me, it's fascinating that none of that is possible without petrochemicals, and i.e., oil and gas.
Right, and you're talking ethane, propane. Those are what you mean by petrochemicals.
Right. So ethane turns into and propane are the building blocks to what ultimately becomes these plastics, which are necessities for everyday life.
Right.
In the medical field, you hear about vaccines, you hear about popular drugs like Lipitor or Tylenol or Advil. Simply not possible. And then you sit back and you say, look, the population is growing not just in the US, but is growing globally in areas, rightfully so, in the emerging markets that want to live more like we want to live.
That's right.
And so demand from a petrochemical perspective for these everyday items, in our view, will continue to grow. And that's a significant demand driver.
Right. Consumption demand just continues to explode.
Yeah, look, in the words of Mark Twain, the death of hydrocarbons has been greatly exaggerated.
I like the spin on that. That's good. Dan, and just kind of thinking about that when you talk about, petrochemicals and their use, and you're thinking about the value of the fossil fuels as investors, I should say. Yep. It's not like it's going away anytime soon.
Yep, absolutely. We think the long-term value of the assets is really tied to the demand for hydrogen, ammonia, carbon capture, right? These are greener thematics that people are very interested in today. I think back to COVID, and every single energy sell-side call that I sat on was about green hydrogen, right? That was the buzzword of that time period.
I remember hearing that a lot as well.
Right, it was a constant refrain. And the reality is the whole thematic is very alluring, right? You have renewable power, you have water, you create a power source from that's green. But the problem is the economics haven't worked out yet, right? They're getting better by the day, but they're nowhere near economic compared to traditional fuels. And so what we're encouraging investors as we're talking to them about it is to think about if you want to move hydrogen, if you want to move ammonia, and again, ammonia is super important, right? The average person doesn't realize that 75+% of ammonia produced in the world today is used for fertilizer, right? We can't produce the food in the quantity that we produce it today without ammonia. But how do you move it?
Right.
How do you store it? How do you process it? And so the answer that we remind clients is it's the existing infrastructure that's in place is really valuable for that area over a longer period of time, because at the end of the day, it's cheaper to repurpose existing assets. It's more environmentally friendly to repurpose existing assets. And most importantly, in our mind, it reduces the red tape, right? If you're using something that's already there and you have the right of way and you have the pipes in the ground, you don't have to go back for approvals.
Right.
And that speeds up the whole process.
And there's some really cool things also happening right now in Asia. There are certain countries that are using carbon capture technology. Obviously, it's a smaller subset of renewables, or maybe, using that kind of, more natural kind of ways to capture energy. Transporting it is obviously very volatile, et cetera. So there's a lot further room to grow. But people are talking about these things. I remember 15 years ago hearing about hydrogen-powered cars, and thinking that was going to be the next wave. But as you just said, Dan, the technology it's slower to catch up. So with that all in mind then, Paolo, when you think about the power demand when it comes to renewables, how do you define power demand? Because right now we know exactly the demand on fossil fuels and to power cities and homes, et cetera. But what about on the renewable side?
Yeah, look, from our perspective, if you look at the overarching thesis, and it's very, very simple, demand for energy will grow in the future. Demand for power will grow in the future. In much of the analysis that we've done, the United States, the world is not ready for the power pull that's coming in the next 3, 5, 10 years. And so you think of everything electric, you think of EVs, you think of artificial intelligence, you think of a lot of these things, and the demand for power is rather overwhelming. An interesting statistic is if you compare the next 10 years versus the past 10 years, demand for power on a relative basis is not growing 20% more. It's not growing 50% more. It's not growing 2 times as much. It's growing 3 times as much. That's significant. I know recently you had a guest on your show to talk about artificial intelligence. That's a huge demand driver. AI data centers, in our analysis, use 4 to 5 times as much power as traditional ones.
That's incredible to see those numbers. That's big. It's kind of like the Bitcoin craze. Mining for it, the consumption of energy is massive.
But it's incremental power, right? And so we're not going to pull from somewhere else. And so from our perspective is how do you invest in this thematic?
Right.
You've seen, at least from our perspective, companies that historically have been boring, i.e. utilities, companies that have gotten beat up a bit over the last few years in terms of interest rates, they're looking at significant growth because they're the ones that are going to supply the power. They're the ones that are going to supply the transmission lines. And so from our perspective, there's a piece of our asset allocation that is tied to this broader thematic.
Guys, thank you so much. I wish we had more time. This is a really interesting conversation, and one that sitting here with both of you, we know that it's got a long story ahead of it that's going to be changing and growing. So I've got to get you back in here one of these days to kind of continue. But I know energy transition now is a massive topic. Maybe the new hashtag will be Energy Edition after people watch the show.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
Paolo, Dan, thanks
Cool.
for having
Thanks,
me. Thanks for being here. We're glad to have you. And thank you for joining us. Make sure you're following all of our content on social media. We're on all the channels, including Instagram. At UBS Trending is where you can find all of that content. Plus, don't forget to check out our website, ubs.com/views. That's our insights page for content from our Chief Investment Office and great partners like Neuberger Berman. Plus, if you have questions about what we talked about today and how it impacts your portfolio, make sure you're talking with your financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. Have a great day, everybody, and remember to keep your eyes on what's trending. We'll see you soon.